behold. It's so lovely to see everybody here, to have come together. I'm Zopa, also Chris, but in these kind of things, I go by my Tibetan name. So I'm Zopa, and I'm here with my wife, Yeshe. She's in the other room, so she's on another camera. And Claire is not here, obviously. She's up Canada way. And it's so lovely to have all of you here, to see everybody here. So before I give our little brief backgrounds of bios of all of us, I just thought I'd speak for a moment on how this came about. So Yeshe and we met Claire in 2017 for the first time at a Generation X Dharma Teachers Conference in Colorado. And we definitely immediately hit it off. It was great. We connected. Yeshe and I were pretty fresh out of our 3-year retreat. So we were still it was really one of the first major things we'd done, even though it was a year after we had gotten out, and we were just starting to come back out into the world. And Claire was there, and we definitely immediately connected because we have studied and taught and translated at Pulahari Monastery in Nepal, and we had been doing that since the early 2000s. And Claire, she had been to the Pulahari program, albeit while we were in retreat. And so she had heard about us, and then we connected over that, and we definitely just hit it off, had that real heart, genuine connection through Dharma. So it was lovely to meet each other. And since then, we've been in contact. We have Zoom chats nowadays, and one of the Zoom chats we were talking, because all three of us love talking Dharma, and we're like, oh, we could let other people listen in on these chats if it was interesting. So we thought, oh, let's try it. And so that's a brief explanation of how this came about. So Claire Villarreal she received her PhD from Rice University in religion, and she's taught academic courses at Rice and Clear Lake, as well as led meditation sessions at Dawn Mountain Center in Houston for Tibetan Buddhism. She's also taught meditation sessions at the Jung Center, Discovery Green, and various other settings in Houston and Fort Worth. She was the programs director at Dawn Mountain from 2015 to 2019. And now adapts traditional Buddhist wisdom for online and in-person spiritual instruction. So she's just such a lovely, thoughtful Dharma teacher and person. So we're really happy to get this chance to collaborate with her. Yeshe and I'll just do it, ours combined, since our path has been, we hang out together a lot. So we're Kagyu practitioners and students of Bokar Rinpoche. He was our main teacher and still is, even though the incarnation we knew him in passed on in 2004. Since 2005, we've been teachers and translators of the Rigpe Dorje Institute for international students at Pulahari Monastery in Kathmandu, which is the seat of Jangten Kundro in Nepal, and mainly studying under Drupal Khenpo Lodro Namgyal there. For several years, we also worked as the grunts, basically, for the Kagyu Monlam prayer festival in Bodh Gaya, which was an annual prayer festival. And in 2016, we completed our 3-year cloistered meditation retreat at Trungpa Rinpoche's center in Crestone, Colorado, the Vajravidya Retreat Center. And so we just love Dharma, love talking Dharma, and really love the traditional methods and exploring that here in the West. So now I'm going to turn it over to Claire.
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel like I actually met Yeshe and Zopa in 2013 when I was at Pulahari studying Rangdong, for those who are interested in the philosophy program there. And people kept asking me, oh, you're from the US. Do you know Yeshe and Zopa? I was like, it's a big country. So I was like super pleased when we finally did meet. Yeah, that program means a lot to me. And it's a really special place for Dorje and the Pulahari Monastery. So I'm super delighted to get to share space with y'all virtually. So I have a couple of quick tech announcements. So first of all, I'm super delighted to see everybody here on Google Meet. It is probably a new platform to some people. So I just want to let you know, if you have a question or a comment, feel free at any time to raise your virtual hand. If you're on a laptop, if you kind of go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a little raise hand icon toward the right. There's also, you'll see a little red like phone icon in the middle, a little phone button that would make you leave the call. So please don't push that. But on the left of that, you'll see a little microphone icon. You can click that and mute your audio. And on the right, you see the little video icon. So I'm guessing everybody's familiar with these, but I would just ask you to keep your audio off unless you're speaking. That way we don't get any feedback or anything like that. I think that's all I need to tell you. Oh, there is also a chat function. So if you go up to the top of the screen, there's a little like speech bubble icon. If you click on that, you can talk with people. And you can also rearrange your view if you click on the little three dots, go up to change layout. You can shift between just showing the speaker and showing everybody. So that's the tech introduction. Any questions about that? Okay, that's the hardest part. So I, as Zopa mentioned, I have an academic background. So when I started thinking about ritual and what does ritual mean to me, what role does it play in my life? Obviously, I started by reading books or a book, and reading an article by one of my lamas, Anne Klein, Lama Riggs and Droma, on tricycle. That was very illuminative. And I came up with a definition for myself of ritual, which is something that marks the boundaries between sacred and profane and communicates across those boundaries. And then last night I decided, no, that's not it. I think really, for me, when I think about ritual more broadly, not just in the context of Buddhism or other spiritual practices, but in the context of my life, I find that really ritual is something that structures my time and it gives meaning to my experience. And so that's kind of where I want to start, actually. I feel like I have a lot of different rituals in my life. Some of them have to do with, for instance, making tea, making coffee, something like that are probably very common and that we can all relate to. And other ones that to me are more about what I consider my connection to the transpersonal, the transcendent. So I figured the easiest way of explaining what ritual means to me is actually taking a couple of examples that I do pretty regularly. One of them is I have a singing bowl by my little practice area. And every time I'm going to start a formal practice session, I sound that bell. And every time I end, I sound the bell again to kind of mark the opening and the closing of practice time. And to me, the function of that little ritual is that it helps to set aside that time so that I'm not checking this amazing device. I'm not, getting up off my cushion every time I have a thought about something I should do. So it really helps to kind of set aside the time and give myself in some way permission to do only practice. And I think part of the value of ritual for me is that it is something that I do either regularly or in this case daily. So I really become habituated. It's almost like Pavlovian, I sound my singing bowl and maybe I don't start salivating, but like I know that I'm about to sit, I know I'm about to do practice. So there's a whole set of associations that simple ritual act kind of brings into play for me. And I think that for me is one of the big values of ritual. Is it's especially rituals that we repeat often enough, they can start to evoke a whole set of responses. And one of the things that my teacher, Anne, really emphasized in her article, which is in Tricycle, I can put it in the chat once I'm not speaking. I can't multitask at all. But she wrote a wonderful article in Tricycle talking about ritual and some of the resistance that we may have as modern people, but then also some of the benefits that specifically ritual offers to us modern folks. And I think one of the big benefits that she flags that I resonate with is that it is a full body practice. There's, physical movement involved often in a ritual. There may be sounding a sacred syllable. So it's getting us out of our heads and getting us to physically take an action. And I think that creates a really rich set of connections and associations that then we are able to draw on easily every time we want to reconnect with, a sitting practice or with a particular Buddha or other type of practice. So that is most of what I wanted to say. I just briefly also want to point out something that I had never realized until I was thinking through ritual for this event, which is that I grew up Christian in the Church of Christ. For anybody who knows them, they're sort of like fundamentalist Southern Baptist, but more so. And it's really, I've heard it described as a religion of engineers. It's like, it's a religion, but it's very stripped of a lot of the sacred elements, or the elements that I recognized in my time in Asia as sacred. So I feel like I really had to start from zero when I started learning how to interact with the sacred through Asian traditions, and particularly the emphasis and the value on ritual. There were obviously rituals in the church where I grew up, but they were never named as such. And the church that I'm thinking of particularly, a small town in North Texas, you can imagine how wildly and religiously diverse it was there. They didn't have pictures of Jesus because that was idolatrous. So there was a real stripping away of any kind of focal point for external supports for the sacred. So for me, learning to bow to a Buddha statue, or offering water at your shrine in the morning, or these days I like to make saffron water, and I like to make offerings to the spirits of the land and the ancestors. And all of that is really, I would say, for me, informed and adapted from my time in Asia and in contact with Asian cultures. And it just struck me that it's such an important part of most traditional forms of Buddhism, and it's really absent, again, for me personally, in my sort of Western upbringing, really until I met the Dharma. So I wanted to reflect on that and throw it out in case it sparks thoughts or reflections in other people. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there and turn the floor over to Yeshe.
Hello. Yeah, my religious upbringing was completely different. For those of you who don't know me, I am a first-generation American. My parents are from Cuba on my mother's side and Spain on my father's. Both of those families long-term have Catholic, and on my mother's side, probably some indigenous religious background. My mother did not raise us as particularly Catholic because she personally preferred the Protestant approach to Christianity. But my father was very Catholic. So I had this weird situation where my mother was probably more observant and not Catholic. My father was Catholic and not as observant. But because of just more mundane situations, I ended up in Catholic school for several years. And I still think of myself as raised Catholic, although it wasn't until later in my childhood that I was more involved with Catholic tradition. And let's say I have a rather intellectual and linear kind of mind. I was a scientist first, and then that wasn't linear enough, so I became a lawyer after that. Uh, this is not the most touchy-feely kind of mind that you've ever experienced. And so it's not surprising that I just kind of rejected all of the religious background I had of any kind, especially all of that incense and chanting and all of that stuff. And when I became interested in meditation and in Buddhism, I avoided Tibetan centers like the plague. They just looked too Catholic to me, and I didn't want anything to do with it. I went to lots of Zen centers for years, convinced that that gorgeous aesthetic was exactly what I needed. Until one day I happened into a library that was having a Tibetan Buddhist talk, and I loved it. So I went to the center where this teacher spoke. And I immediately felt at home with all that incense and the chanting and the colors and everything else. So what I realized for me, and continued to happen for the last 20 years that I've been practicing, is that for me, ritual is really about a sense of home, you could say, but, and I wouldn't have used this word, to be completely honest, until somewhere in the middle of 3-year retreat not too long ago. But to me, ritual became a way of working with intimacy and inner intimacy in our practice. So when I think about ritual, I loved how Claire talked about, what does that mean? For me, it's a physical or a verbal act or set of acts that reflects an inner intention. It might even put that inner intention into order or even encourage that inner intention. And specifically, I find that when I'm explaining it, I would never say intimacy, back to that very linear scientific legal mind. When I'm doing it, it's only about intimacy. When I'm actually there, it's about connecting that body, speech, and mind, which is so much a part of the Tibetan Buddhist practice, bringing those into a unified stream that brings a sense of more depth and more intimacy in my practice. So for me, it was very helpful. And I think everybody is very different, but I think our society as a whole is definitely much more cognitive in focus than traditional Buddhist cultures, especially in times of old. And I was definitely an example of that. And for me, kind of like most of us have one dominant hand. Not that many of us are ambidextrous. I'm almost entirely right-handed. Another expression of this. And I was really at first looking for something that resonated with that intellectual and cognitive approach, which is my habit and it was my comfort zone. The ritual aspects of practice really challenged me in a way that was very nourishing. Not always the most comfortable, but always felt very safe and always felt very expansive. It allowed me to become a little more ambidextrous in my spiritual practice. So it wasn't entirely an intellectual approach, but it also opened up emotional and even psychological channels that were not always as easily accessible for me in contexts outside of my spiritual practice. So I think that's all I want to say to start out. But I'm hoping that we'll have a lot more time to talk with each other and all of you very shortly. So, on to Zopa.
Yeah, I got the gears turning from what both of you are talking about. I think for me, when I think about ritual, to me, it really seems like it's a training in as well as a practice of presence. So, like when I was starting out on the Buddhist path and I heard about a 3-year retreat, I was like, oh, that's crazy. I would never do that. Mainly, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I would never do that, but one of the reasons was just because of the whole like sleeping, sitting up, and I was like, no, I love my sleep. I'm never going to do that. So, but of course, then over time, I got more and more interested. And then I was like, oh, okay, maybe. But the main reason that I wanted to do the traditional cloistered 3-year retreat was just because of this sense of missing being present in the now, in my life. And I've felt like, okay, this like deep immersion of 3-year cloistered retreat, which really to me is about ritual. It's like full on like immersion in ritual, whether you're in the sessions or in between sessions. There's all sorts of practices you have to do. And there's a lot of sessions during the day. It's a lot of time practicing ritual and switching between rituals and all of these things. And paradoxically, as often happens in Buddhism, as Yeshe and I have often remarked to each other, we kind of had to do 3-year retreat in order to realize like that main point of doing 3-year retreat, you don't have to do it. You can always choose to be present. And I think ritual is the way, for me, I understand ritual as the way that grounds us, the way that we practice that, the way that we can, I love what you were saying, Claire, about like that. It's almost like that permeable boundary between the sacred and profane, helping us to tap into the sacredness that is always there, but that we get so distracted by samsaric mind that we don't access. And so that's really how I think of ritual. To me, it feels like there's so many different ways of knowing, of experiencing. And particularly in our current time, there's a heavy emphasis on the intellectual, on rational knowing. And there's certainly a place for that in practice and in our spiritual path. But I feel like the ritual, and here I'm really talking about like the formalized sadhana practices or meditation practices, whatever type of practice it is that you do, that there's something about that helps. I find it helps me like connect and experience with the underlying philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism in a way that's not about thinking them through as much as it is about experience, like the vivid putting oneself in the experience. And there's more I can say about that, but I think as the two of you mentioned, I think that's enough. One other thing, I guess, just in terms of personal experience, I feel like there's something about ritual that is so moving. Like for me personally, I remember the first time I went to Asia in particular, and by that time, which was in 2000, and by that time I had grown up around Tibetan Buddhist practice, and so I was used to Chenrezig chanting and practice and Green Tara, but there was something about going to a culture where it was so saturated with it, where you at 5 o'clock in the morning you hear the monasteries all around you, like doing different rituals, and you hear the horns and drums, and there's something very viscerally moving about that, and having that sense of really being steeped and surrounded in a different sense of the world is something that I love about ritual. But yeah, so I'll stop there. I think the way that we had discussed how to do this is we have some questions for each other, and you all may have had questions that come up. So please feel free at any point to do that raise hand icon if there's a question that comes up, or wave like Yeshe is showing. Anything is fine. And yeah, we'll just jump into a discussion. We don't have a particular place we need this to go. We just want to explore ritual and enjoy. So I think I might actually start that by asking both Yeshe and Claire, but actually, Claire, it was something that you mentioned in thinking about ritual, in how like that difference in the definition. So at first you were thinking about it as like that bringing the sacred into our immediate experience, but then it sounded like you expanded it into like recognizing all of the little rituals that we do. And I'm curious about this because I was actually having a conversation about a month ago with a psychologist, and we were talking. One of the things that I really feel passionately about is bringing more ritual into Western life. I feel like there's a real hunger for it that people may not recognize. And he was saying, there's ritual every day. That, having tea with friends is ritual. Going into a therapist's office and like closing the door and sitting down, like that is ritual. And while I agree with that, it also seems to me like there's a hunger for more. So that sense of intentionality seems really important in that transformative aspect. And I didn't know, Claire, if you had any more thoughts about that, or Yeshe.
Yeah, well, I think that word you just used, transformative, for me is really important in the difference between what I would call like maybe a ritual that makes meaning, or that helps to kind of mark and separate the stages of my day. I love the ritual of making coffee. Putting the water in the pot, in the kettle, putting the right amount of coffee. There's something very like standardized and comforting about doing that. And it marks like this is the beginning of the day. But I think the difference, as I reflect on that, which gives meaning, but I wouldn't say it's sacred, as I reflect on the difference between that and a ritual that I would say marks off sacred time for me, like the one that I use to kind of open and close my morning practice, I think part of the difference for me, and maybe part of the reason that, a lot of people in the modern West might not light up when they hear the word sacred, is I don't think we are raised to appreciate the sacred as a category in the way that someone in a Tibetan culture would, for instance. Like if I just think about the way that books are treated in like the Christian church where I grew up, or just in our culture generally, like a Tibetan would never put a book on the ground and then possibly step on it or sit on it. And in church, I remember seeing Bibles on the floor under pews, people putting their feet on them. And it didn't strike me at all as strange that like your sacred text, you just put it on the ground and put your feet on it, until I got back from Asia. And I was like, what are y'all doing? This is not even my sacred text, but I would never put this on the ground. And I feel like that is really something that ritual in a sacred transformative context has to offer to us as modern people, to show us that there is actually a way that like the sacred is not just some fuzzy like woo-woo kind of category, but there's actually a way to incorporate it into daily life. That when you live backlit by what's sacred, it feels different. And I think part of maybe that reluctance to go for a sacred ritual as opposed to a more secular ritual like going into your therapist's office is that I think in certain ways, like our culture just has a deep suspicion going back to at least the 1600s in Western Europe, a deep suspicion of religion, and a sort of like somewhat helpful, but somewhat not helpful, like recognition of the downsides of religion and the dark side. And, you even have this phrase, spiritual but not religious. People are trying to say, like, I like the good stuff, but I'm going to leave aside that, whatever religion means to them, they're going to leave that somewhere else. And I think it's that kind of like almost PTSD when it comes to the sacred, that it really is a handicap for people to understand what Buddhism really is. It's not just mindfulness, or to engage in ritual practice in a way that feels authentic and meaningful, that you're not just like bowing because you're supposed to bow to the Buddha. Like you're bowing because that image reflects something really important about ourselves that we don't notice unless we make an effort to. Yeah. So I think that transformative aspect to me is a really important distinction between, a sort of like everyday secular ritual versus the kinds of rituals that are calling on you to do something uncomfortable. Because if it was comfortable, it wouldn't be making us grow and realize things about ourselves. So I appreciate the question. It made me think more deeply about my own experience.
And what do you have a sense of, like, what is it that makes it transformative? Is it the fact that that has come down to us through, like, people or beings that we consider, like, realized or accomplished, or like the formalized practices that we receive from our teachers through the lineage, or intentionality, like our own sense of, like, because when you were talking, like, I know there's times when, just like you're talking about, like making a cup of tea, like I feel like that can be transcendent, right? That can be tapping into the sacredness, like with the Buddha's gathas, right? That remind us of being mindful with whatever we're doing, right? Like closing a door, may I close the door to negative actions in the lower realms, right? So something that's very profane normally, that we don't normally think about, but then all of a sudden we make it sacred, right? But so do you have a sense of what it is that transformation?
I guess my sense of it is kind of along the lines of what you said. It's sort of how we approach each of those actions. Because, you know, Kim just wrote in chat, I think every moment, yeah, this moment is as holy as you allow it to be. It kind of feels like every moment is potentially sacred. I think we have a lot of ways of insulating ourselves from that aspect of reality. You know, I think certainly I can sit down and do practice and never allow myself to be touched or transformed by it. Or I can sit down and do the same practice and realize, like, oh my God, you know, there's a layer of like self-identity that this is gonna peel off if I let it. Do I want to let that happen or not? And you know, I think to do a practice in a transformative way, I think the power and the blessings of lineage are actually important in that. But I think it takes more. It takes recognizing that we can be transformed, that there's the possibility of transformation. And I think, you know, too often maybe in like a sort of secular Buddhist approach in the modern West, that aspect of transformation, that potential for like fully awakening isn't necessarily what's emphasized. So yeah, I feel like maybe that approach, for me anyway, I feel like the approach to practice is probably at least as important as the other elements of like what the ritual is and whatnot. I'm curious to hear Yeshe's thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I think my thoughts are along the same lines. I loved Kim's statement about the moment being as holy as you allow it to be, because part of that sense of intimacy that I get out of ritual is really hand in hand with that sense of allowing or being receptive to what's already there. So it's not so much that you're creating something newly, but sort of plugging in to, you know, kind of supra mundane way of being that we tend to have blinders to most of the time. That's my experience of it. And ritual, whether it seems on the outside to be mundane or sacred, but to me, again, there's that sense of that intimacy between the inner and outer realms of things. I could be making my espresso, which I've been making for as long as I can think of every morning, for everybody's benefit, not my own. But most of the time I am just doing it as something that I do. But if I'm doing it out of the recognition of the sacredness of that moment, of all the things coming together, that really just changes not just that moment, that cup of espresso, but it starts to change the whole day. It's to the extent that there's an intimacy, there's a communication between the physical or verbal thing that's constituting the visible act and that inner intention, that's where that connection to what makes something sacred lives for me. How much are those seemingly dual things actually in communication as I'm doing it? The more and more I bring them in communication, the closer and closer I'm getting it to a sense of more of a unity between all of that, which to my mind is much closer to the way things actually are than the much more compartmentalized, much more separate, much more neatly put into boxes kind of way that we normally live. And that was really powerful for me. That's one of the things that I found so powerful about this style of practice. I mean, think about it. Attaining enlightenment, completely removing all kleshas, all traces of karma. We're going to do this in 30 minutes of meditation every day. So then what's the solution? We're going to just have to sit in meditation all day, every day, and not eat, not sleep, not work. That's not going to work either. But this approach that integrates all of those things, the work, the eating, the sleeping, the meditation, all of it, making all of it sacred, making all of it something that aligns body, speech, and mind in a way that's closer and closer to that transcendent unity. That to me sounds like something that has the potential to actually produce that state that is already within us and hidden over from the Kagyu perspective. So that's how I think of it in that transformative sense. You might even say a lot of the Kagyu texts would say we call it transformation from the perspective of samsaric mind, everyday mind, but it's actually not a transformation at all. It's more like an unveiling or just revealing what's already been present all along. And that to me is where the power of ritual really lies, that sense of really putting yourself in a space that you may not necessarily do. It definitely opens up a different way of knowing, a different dimension that's a lot more embodied, a lot more, to use a word we've been using, a lot more transcendent or supra-mundane than the usual ways of knowing. And that's how it's really powerful for me. I'd also like to hear from everybody else here what their sense of ritual is and what's been powerful or maybe just kind of intimidating about it or may have brought up resistance. Let's see, Forrest has his hand up.
So I have a tendency to delude definitions to the point of almost uselessness. But ritual, I've for a long time taken to just mean the union of action with intention. And really, whatever that intention is what makes it sacred or not sacred. Or even really, I don't know that the intention matters because maybe just being so close to your intention is an actual sacred act. But yeah, that's what ritual kind of has been to me.
Yeah, I really like that, Forrest. One thing that comes up for me, because as you mention it, there's obviously there's a lot of talk, and there has been now for decades, of like, generating an American Buddhism, right? Of bringing Buddhism to the West and like leaving behind the cultural trappings of the different cultures that it's come from, or that kind of thing. And for those of you that don't know Yeshe and myself, we're definitely very like traditionalists. So take this with a grain of salt. This is our approach. But for me, I feel like, so as you were mentioning that, I feel like yeah, it is action and intention. It's like action meeting intention, and our intention is so important. But I love something that Claire mentioned before, which is that aspect of resistance and growth. And for me personally, I feel like there's something really powerful in being able to rely on something that I feel like has come from wisdom, as opposed to something that's come from intellect, or so the rational mind trying to make sense of, trying to make sacred out of the profane, instead of a recognition of the sacred in things that may not seem like they have anything to do with it. I mean, when we look at a lot of the Vajrayana practices, right? Like, what does like full body prostrations have to do with recognizing the sacredness, right? Or burning things and offering it to the spirits, so those kind of things. So I feel like there's also this aspect of, I don't know, trust, or of like where we put that. And part of the reason I came up with your comment, Forrest, was because I in talks with other like Western Buddhist Dharma teachers, and there's some sense of like creating new sadhanas or things like that, which I think is fine for in certain circumstances and certain criteria. But I know that I have like a little bit of a traditionalist personal like sense of like, oh, I feel like these sadhanas that have come down through the lineage that have been tried out basically for millennia, I feel like I have no doubt that I can trust that, because I feel like the results have been proven, whereas I'm not so sure about other stuff. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
So I came from my journey into spiritualism first took me through the Western occult, and it's very much shaped my approach to it, and my exploration in that was very individualistic. You designed all your own ritual, so I have a hard time doing only rituals that have been created for me. They seem to miss a certain type of investment on my part. And I also think that while I love the sadhanas, I do think that there's a certain need for sadhanas that speak to the cultural psyche of the Westerner, in a way that a lot of these rituals that come down from Tibet just they don't have any of that connection, because it's just, why would they?
I love that. Thank you. And I'm curious, because to me, what part of what I hear you saying is very similar to like what Yeshe was mentioning about intimacy, right? How do we develop intimacy with the practice? How do we make the practice, the ritual, our own? So Yeshe, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, or you want to hear from others.
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, I totally get that. And there's a couple of things. One thing I'm immediately reminded of, if any of you saw the webcast or were at Pulahari last year when Drupal Khenpo Lodro Namgyal, the teacher there, was teaching on Chenrezig, somebody asked exactly that kind of question. No, I'm not so sure about all this image of the colors and the arms and the legs. First of all, it's not a Tibetan, particularly Tibetan approach. This is something that came from Indian Tantric Buddhism into Tibet. So it wasn't something that Tibetans necessarily developed in a particular way. The iconography goes back farther. But what the Drupal Khenpo said was, it's about familiarity. I grew up, he was saying, I grew up in the mountains of Kinnour, in a small village where everybody knew each other, and everybody's families had been there for countless generations. The first time I went down into a major town and saw a white person, I thought they were like hideous. They were like monsters. I wasn't used to them. I thought they were weird and scary. And over time, I got more and more used to them. And then they seem completely normal because you just become more familiar. So for me, part of that aspect, when we're talking about the more particularized ritual, when we're talking about like iconography or particular prayers or particular ways of doing things that we're not familiar with, I personally have gotten a lot of value in sort of giving myself over to the practice. And this resonates with what Zopa was saying for me. Just having, because it's coming from a wisdom tradition, from teachers that I feel I can trust over time, because I've developed that trust, not because somebody's forcing me. I'm willing to give myself or to lay my trust in that and see what happens. That's not something that I feel very comfortable doing, frankly, in my life. Certainly before I got involved with Dharma, I was very uncomfortable doing that. And so that was one of the ways that this spiritual practice of ritual actually opened up lots of healing, emotional and even psychological channels of healing that I would never have associated with spiritual ritual at all. So I totally get what you're saying, because even in 3-year retreat, there were, especially early on, there were things we were doing, and I was like, what the heck? Who is this guy? Where the hell's the Buddha in all of this? So yeah, I get that resistance. It still comes up, and I'm glad of it, because it's some kind of fruiting of blocks to that sense of intimacy, to that sense of I'm going to lead with trust, and trusting lineage, trusting experience, trusting my heart more than my fears and my worries and my need to put everything in my particular ways of doing it. Do I still do things my way? That's the second part of this. I promise you that no matter who organized that ritual, when you give yourself over to it, you are going to be providing your own personal investment. It is structured. It is built into the ritual. That is what is so wise. That is what is so beautiful about it, is that it seems like a structure that it's binding, but it's actually a structure that allows you to inhabit and fill that space in a way that's very unique. Christopher mentioned earlier, Zopa mentioned earlier, how similar our backgrounds are. We've been studying with the same teachers for decades. We were literally a wall apart in 3-year retreat. And we had completely different experiences from the same exact practices, because that's where the intimacy comes. It's where, it's kind of like if you meet somebody new from a new culture, you don't go in there saying, well, you got to do everything different because I'm not used to your culture and I'm not going to relate to your culture. That's part of the interest. That's part of the excitement, the exploration, the curiosity of being able to have that back and forth and develop intimacy in that new space. So that's how I've experienced it. But that doesn't mean that there isn't that irritation there. I still get that. That there isn't something to explore and to work with and to go deeper into. I have found that when I let myself lead with trust and bring my grumbling with me, it works really well. Something just sort of opens up in a way that relates to me individually, that the practice just shares. I'd like especially to ask my dear, dear Dharma sister, Kim, what she thinks about this. Kim, for the rest of you, is a Dharma teacher in the Theravada tradition and is very involved in contemporary Vipassana. So I'd love to hear your take on ritual and how it relates to your style of practice.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. I don't know that I have anything, so I've really appreciated the eloquence and beauty. I agree with much of what is said. I have my own background is similar to Yeshe's in that I was originally trained in science, and so I wasn't so interested in the heart aspects, the giving over, the faith, all of that. And so I have found my home in the Insight tradition, which is a little bit halfway in between, let's say, the Zen tradition and the Tibetan tradition in terms of the amount of ritual and practice and structure. And so I think somehow this middle way is working well for me. I do agree with the sense of discovering the intimacy and the sacredness in giving oneself over somehow to ritual. We don't have a lot in the Theravadan tradition, in that when it was brought over from the Asia, some of that was stripped away by the teachers who brought it. It was brought by lay teachers, and they deliberately didn't want us to look like Thai or Burmese ritualistic faith practices, because they thought that wouldn't work very well in the West, and probably it wouldn't if they had tried to translate that directly. But the history is that things are starting to be added back in, and we're starting to create forms. My teacher created a minister form, so that's almost Western looking, but there's a little ritual to be ordained as a minister. And most recently, just in the last few months, another form has been created for dedicated practitioners. It's not very well known yet, but we're starting to, and the ritual that goes with that is also quite transformative. So there's starting to be a need to bring it back in. So maybe I'll quote Suzuki Roshi, going back to our Zen friends, where he said, "No ritual is a problem, too much ritual also a problem." And so he again advocated kind of this middle way. So yeah, I'm going to come down on the side of it's uncomfortable for a linear Western mind, and it's really good medicine. Thank you.
I'd like to make a confession here. Just going back to Forrest's point, I have actually experimented with doing like a guru yoga or deity yoga style practice with like superheroes. And also with, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Kung Fu Panda films, but with the turtle, the amazing like Kung Fu turtle master from those films. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, but I've done guru yoga with him. So I think there's a lot of like flexibility, having the forms of these traditional ritual practices and then having some of the content that resonates, with just our own cultural myths. I think there's a lot to be done still in terms of what emotionally resonates with us and what the forms that the tradition offers. But I do think if it's too comfortable, it's probably not transforming us.
Yeah, I do want to clarify one thing. I'm not saying that there won't be changes to ritual and to iconography and to forms as time goes on. Even the Tibetan forms that came from India were somewhat tweaked just because of practice. I just feel that there's a difference when that comes out of an embedded practice, and it's a fruit of that practice and of realization, as opposed to, you know what, I'm not even going to start until I edit this practice. For me, there's a difference there that, and I suspect that happened in Tibet and in other countries that were bringing different forms. As Kim mentioned, even in Theravada traditions, in the countries that are more culturally embedded in Theravada, there is a lot of ritual. So, I mean, all of these, and that's very cultural. And I think it grows out of that culture. We haven't had much time for that to happen. We haven't had as much, a huge critical mass of realized masters that come from the West yet. We just haven't had time for that kind of thing. I do think there's a much more organic procedure that yields those differences in ritual in a way that's very different than just sort of coming in and saying, oh, I'm going to just change this from the outset. But I think it's a lot of fun to do practice from what works for us. For me personally, the more I try to tweak practices, the more I realize how much richer it is when I don't. Colleen, I loved your comment. I'd love to hear more. You say that for you, ritual is whether mundane or sacred centers you and helps to define your thoughts and actions. Can you say more about that?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it goes back to how I was raised also, like the way you shared how you know, Claire and Zopa and Yeshe, how the three of you were raised, and also with Kim. I grew up in a Japanese Buddhist in the Pure Land tradition, not the new Pure, not Shin Jodoshu, but Jodoshu. And so there's a lot of ritual that I just accepted because I'm just a kid. I'm just a child being taken to temple, and it's also not just Buddhist, but it's also Shinto. With Japanese, it's two religions. So I just followed that, and to me, the practices that we have that are everyday kinds of things include what you say before you take a bite of food, and what you say after you eat, what you say when you're leaving the house and when you return. And it's just those kinds of normal everyday things that preserve your space and your just your being in that kind of world. And then I saw something. It's going to take a little longer. I have to share it with you because it was so interesting to me. There is a world-class Olympic skater who won twice in the recent, well, a couple years ago, Olympics, by the name of Yuzuru Hanyu, who is a representative from Japan. And at that time, his long piece was showing, he was portraying somebody by the name of Seimei, who was a scholar and also sort of a geomancer. And he told the people about how he created a space because of the noise. And this was not at the Olympics, this was at a different tournament, because of the noise and because he was displeased that the crowd was yelling somebody else's name, that he created a space, and then at the end of the performance, he closed it again. And I thought that ritual was so important for him and for Japan itself, because what he represents and what he says and what the people believe, and what I believe too, is that at that time when he's portraying good fighting evil and showing both the splendor and the strength of the culture as well as the delicacy. And so when he created this space and then closed it again at the end of the performance, I thought, wow, this is something that, I don't know, to me was important for understanding their culture and understanding what he was doing with that performance. And when you talk about ritual being performance and all of that, Oh, that's it.
Thank you, Colleen. I saw a little earlier that Elise, you had your hand raised. I didn't know if you wanted to speak. Go ahead. You're still muted.
I was just writing this. What I realize about ritual is a rhythm arises inside by applying myself to the ritual and learning in my Tibetan Buddhist practice and in my root practice, the ritual of either of them, my root practice being a Christian mystic practice. and applying myself to the ritual in freshness, not in shouldness, then a rhythm arises in my psyche that I cannot fabricate, and that rhythm nourishes me. And through time, I trust that the maturation that comes from the word you used, intimacy, Yeshe, with the practice. It's intimacy with myself, intimacy with life, from a viewpoint that I would not have from my habitual mind. And so ritual is like a ladder lifting me to a rhythm in psyche that I could not get to without the ritual. And that I'm hoping, or I believe, because I've been doing it for many years, that this is maturing me to a point where, through that rhythm becoming more the habit of my mind than the habits of my mind, earlier habits, then that will bring me to a point where all experience in life, all life is experienced as ritual. The whole thing, the good, the bad, the ugly, the confusion. And I truly believe I'm coming to that because ritual brings forth the intimate sacredness of life every moment, no matter how mundane the my more daily activities are. Something like that is what I wanted to share. And I'm just so stimulated by what each of you have said. It's wonderful. So thank you. And I only go dark because I have to lie down. So don't mind me. Thank you.
Oh, that was very beautifully stated. I really appreciate that. And it calls to mind actually one of the questions that's been going on that I'd like to ask maybe Claire, just to hear from, partially because I hear from Yeshe and I talk about these things a lot. So, but is just that sense of ritual like, how do you keep ritual from becoming rote? Like, I think there's this really important aspect of, and one of my more profound experiences was in 3-year cloistered retreat, because we have so many rituals and they're continually pulling the rug out from under you when you're doing the retreat, because you just start to get used to it. And then it's like, okay, now you have to do another practice and you have to learn all the chanting and the tunes and the music and the visualization and all of these different things. And so in some ways there was like this real, I don't know, frustration and like continually butting up against a sense of inadequacy. So I feel like that's on one side, is like that sense of it's new, I can't do it. So that's where I know in myself some resistance comes from. But then on the other hand, there's that place where ritual does become rote, where it's no longer conscious, it's not intentional. It's just like, oh yeah, I know this so well. It's almost like you're anticipating, everything that's going to happen without it. So I didn't know, Claire, if you had any more thoughts on how to work with that, or what that brings up.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I wish I had like a good answer for that. I mean, I think this is, as you were talking, Zopa, my mind was kind of rhyming the words ritual and habitual. And it's sort of like it's like habit can become the near enemy, of ritual. I feel like the purpose of ritual is to wake us up, to bring us back into like the fullness of this moment. But I mean, what you're saying perfectly highlights the fact that often we use it to escape from, or it can become another form of, almost spiritual materialism. I guess for me, this is, a lot has been said about intention and the attitude almost that we take as we approach ritual. And I guess for me, that's that's where, you know, maybe some of this fresh and innovative energy, like what Forrest was talking about or what Colleen was talking about, where that kind of like, I don't know, for me, in my best ritual moments, like that can kind of infuse something that's very familiar, and I've chanted it, you know, the same exact words, I don't know how many times. But that sense of like, I wonder what's going to happen this time. You know, almost like a scientist looking through a microscope. Like we spent all this time developing this tool of inquiry, which is ritual, or it can be how ritual functions. And, you know, to then use it to just try and see the same old thing every day, it seems like such a waste. But yeah, I guess for me, it feels like that's where the rest of my practice comes in and helps connect with that freshness and with that, you know, ability to really be in that moment and that intimacy with experience that Yeshe was talking about. I mean, that's my aspiration. Whether or not it happens on a daily basis is something else. And before I wrap up my comments, I just want to say I'm really, really interested to hear from Kim that some of the ritual is starting to come back in. I found that super fascinating, and I didn't want to gloss over that. I just, you know, I wanted to address what Forrest had said. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's just trying to find that balance between ritual and habitual and trying to keep it fresh and alive. And I see that Kim and Halise have their hands up. I realized we didn't actually set a closing time for this. Um, so do y'all want to try and wrap up in maybe 10 more minutes, or do you want to go until half after? Half after? Okay, cool. Oh, it looks like Halise doesn't actually have a comment. So Kim, I think, is next.
Yeah, maybe one additional piece to throw in. I love that we're getting to the part about ritual getting a little bit rote sometimes, is to bring in the idea that we can do a ritual and participate in it at the same time as knowing that it's empty, right? There's nothing actually fundamentally happening there unless we allow it, maybe. And so it's maybe that knowledge that helps bring in the skillful dimension to the ritual, both in being able to participate in it fully and in not allowing it to kind of become a stricture on the mind. So there's a way in which I loved what Zopa said about you have to do the 3-year retreat to realize that you don't need to do a 3-year retreat in order to become present. I think those are both true. So, you know, you have to do ritual in order to discover that it's empty and that there's the freedom within it. This also guards against believing that ritual itself is what liberates, because it doesn't. And so, but it's a skillful means. So I just bring in that side of the emptiness as one more consideration.
Yeah, I want to just chime in on that because I think that's so essential. I mean, for me, again, going back to how I think about ritual, it's always about that dance between the set of the acts and that inner intention. If your intention is absent, then that's where we get rote. The acts are just not infused with a particularly spiritual intent or transcendent intent. And that's rote. It's just a bunch of acts with nothing behind them. Whereas on the full side of the spectrum, there's almost like a seamless unity between the physical verbal act and the intention, so that one is just a effortless kind of outgrowth of the other, and you can't even make very clear distinctions between them. I tend to fall somewhere between. But for me, and I loved the way Halise said it, the shouldness, not doing it as the shouldn't, out of the shouldness, but out of the trust, out of the open-heartedness, out of the intention for me. Really connecting with, well, what's my intention? So many of it's so beautiful because the prayers that we think of, oh, you're just doing that as piety, as lip service, as rote. Those very prayers, the refuge prayers, whatever form we use, are meant to ignite that intention. So right there, those prayers that we might take up as rote acts, verbal acts in that case, are actually meant to ignite that intention that just circle back and make the prayers full and rich and powerful and not just lip service. So again, that real sense of a dance, that sense of intimacy, that sense of, finding, I've heard several people talk about it, newness and freshness in your own individual connection in things that you're familiar with. And, we do this all the time. We have family that we've known forever. We're in relationships and marriages and friendships. We do have a tendency, it's easier to just assume people are the same and the connection is the same. And but it's so much fresher. It's so much more alive. It's so much more, well, let's just say it. It's just a lot sexier if we're fresher and newer and stay with it. And, why not bring that sexiness to the spirituality? Why not bring in the sense of the freshness and the curiosity and that sort of living, not knowing what the next thing is? It's not the words that make things seem so familiar or, boring. Again, it's the intention. What are we bringing to it? Where can I find new areas to expand my heart around these words instead of falling into the shouldness of it?
That's so beautiful. And it's so funny because while I definitely love that, and I love what we're talking about, but one of the things that's been coming up for me that I feel like it's important to bring into the space as well is I feel like some of, again, ritual as a different way of knowing, right? A different way of working with ourselves and with what's going on in us. So I just also want to bring up the point of, of resistance, of when we're practicing, because I know that there's been times when I've been practicing and some of the most, I would say, like transformative experiences I've had have been at times when I really don't want to do the practice, when I really don't want to be doing it. And there's resistance, and it's not even that it's become rote. It's that I'm not there, and yet I feel like there's this power, and there's something that's going on below the surface of my feeling of resistance, of being bored with it, of these different things that, and this is where that like trust in the wisdom of the practices that have come to us really hits me, because it feels like it's in that very feeling and in that very like still basically making myself do the practice, making myself do whatever 5,000 more mantras or another 100 prostrations or whatever it is, that there's something transformative in that happens below the level of my, not just my intellectual like figuring it out, but my emotional feeling of it, my emotional feeling of disconnection. So even sometimes when I'm feeling disconnected from the practice is still working on me the ritual is still working on me at a different level. So I just want to bring that in there too, because I feel like to me, that's also an important piece.
And I noticed that Halise had raised her hand. I just would like to respond quickly to what you said, Zopa, that I think it's often the resistance that makes the practice still interesting to me. Like that's different every time. So I just wanted to throw that out, that it feels like an important part of the process to feel the resistance, and to engage in the practice anyway. And Halise.
Let's see. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I meant to go to chat. And what I was saying in chat was, yes, about resistance. For me too, it becomes transformative. And so much in my Tibetan practices, I feel so obstacled that I sit and cry, trying to integrate get through some obstacle about hearing and seeing and doing the practice. So yeah, I just really appreciated you saying that, Zopa, because so anyway, but thank you all very much. Didn't mean to raise that hand. Thanks. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Elise. And Rob raised his hand.
Hi. So, like Claire, I'm both an academic and a practitioner, and in my academic research, I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and study ritual. So it's an interesting dance. But one thing I just wanted to throw out there that has been very clear to me is from working with Native American people, there's just such a difference too, I think, in the conceptualization of ritual when a person is in a cultural milieu where ancestors mean so much and land means so much, and one has been dwelling, a person and all of their group and their ancestors have dwelt in this one place for hundreds, thousands of years, since they would say the beginning of time. And those rituals were established in that sacred beginning of time. And by tapping into those, it's not just like, this is the way things have always been done, but this is, it's sort of primordial. And I know personally, that's very different than like, okay, well, I came across Tibetan Buddhism when I was a kid and I got into it, and I, by doing the rituals, feel connected with this longer lineage. But it seems to me, based on these experiences, that there's something just profoundly different when it's sort of in family and in land and in deep time, that you're tapping into. It is that lineage principle, but on a very profound level. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That's what came to mind. And one other thing that's been sort of spinning around is, various people have touched on it, but that I think part of the wisdom of ritual is that it can be anything. It can be anything. And that's almost the point. It's sometimes, for me, almost more powerful to be presented with the most absurd thing possible as a ritual. Like, knead this dough and then shape it into something, vaguely phallic, and then twirl it around in front of the altar and then run outside with it. And it's like, that teaches me a lot about my own mind when I'm given that situation. Like, relate to this thing that seems totally bizarre, and then doing it over and over again. How has my mind changed? How is my relating to it changed? So thank you, and it's really nice to be here with everybody.
Thank you, Rob. That was awesome. And the first piece that you were talking about, I just want to put in there really quick because it came up, was it's really about making the Dharma personal, right? It's really and not in a intellectual way as much as in a heartfelt sense, like it belongs to me and I belong to it, right? There's a beautiful quote from the Buddha that says, the Dharma is no one's property. It belongs to whoever realizes it. And that's really what came up with regard to your first point. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Zopa, I want to ask you about something that Rob reminded me of when he was talking about the Native American traditions, because you did, for the rest of you who don't live with Zopa, Zopa did a wilderness fast in the Native American tradition a couple of months ago, and I'd like to hear more from you about what it was like to be in a ritual space that was very much a traditional space, but not what you're used to.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually, because that certainly was more of a direct confrontation, I guess, within myself with ideas. I feel like one of the things I'm wrestling with as I go back to grad school in Western psychology and am interacting with a whole bunch of different like belief systems and ways of that people make sense of the world, is I see in myself a very like, egoistic, prideful, like self-oriented sense of like, because I believe so much in the Dharma and because I've done so much, and also truthfully, just because part of our training at Pulahari is in Buddhist philosophical debate, which is about like examining things for logical inconsistencies and pointing those out and debating it and trying to wrap your mind around it as a way of really seeing the blind spots that we all hold. I'm definitely confronted with that in general in my graduate school experience, and it keeps coming up, and it makes me realize one thing: A, how prideful I am; B, that the Dharma doesn't need me to defend it, right? There's, it's fine. I don't have to convince anyone else. And so that interior, that shifts that I have to do over and over and over again of switching my viewpoint to look at my experience as opposed to try to like shore it up by convincing somebody else of its validity is a really valuable exercise that is excruciating that I keep having to do. So that's the general piece. In terms of the wilderness fast, there definitely was some of that, because there was some talk of a whole bunch of different rituals from a different indigenous perspective. At the same time, I also had this connection, kind of like Rob was saying, where I love the land and I feel like there's something about nature, there's something about being out in it, about really connecting in that deep way that feels so powerful. So I already had some of that inclination going for me in it. And I think the main takeaway that I got from the wilderness fast was the sense, kind of like what we're all speaking about here, is the importance of ritual, is the importance of bringing ourselves to it, and how ritual works in ways that aren't about us figuring it out, which I feel like is such a huge relief to us, even though we don't know it. That I think we're so hungry for. So I feel my personal experience in the wilderness fast, I brought in a whole bunch of my Buddhist practice to do. So that was fine and that helped. And I also recognized some and gained from some of the wisdom that brought up.
I know we're running close to the time we said we'd stop. And I know that Pushpa does not like to talk in groups. But Pushpa, if you can hear me, you have a very unique just life history when it comes to ritual. You have several different cultural references around ritual and spiritual practice. And I'd really just love to hear a little tiny bit from you. Plus, I love to push you a little bit past your edge because it's good for you. So can you say a little bit, anything you like about how, what it's meant for you, or what is difficult or easy, or whatever?
All the way from there, you're pushing me.
Yes.
Well, I was born in a Hindu family, and my family is very ritualistic. My mom and dad were very ritualistic. We were brought up to actually go to the temples every day in the morning at 5 and in the evening at 5 and do all the rituals in the temple. So I don't find rituals themselves very difficult to accept. For me, it comes very easily and naturally. I have full trust on what rituals can do for me. for my personal growth and improvement. Though I have very little experience or basically no experience, I do them anyway. Now into Buddhism, the way I'm seeing rituals happening and the way the way I'm taught to do them, I sometimes end up comparing what I used to do with my parents. And I never knew what I was doing at that time. But now things make so much more sense as in physical doing them and what growth they have, what it's taught me. I don't know what the words are, but my experiences, the rituals have definitely have brought in some experiences for me. Okay?
Fantastic. Thank you, sweetheart.
Thank you.
That's perfect.
It's great to hear from someone who grew up engaged with ritual and is still doing it, and to hear everything that everyone has shared here. I want to respect everybody's time. I know we're at the time limit. Sounds like Rob has his hand raised. Do you have something quick? Oh, okay, that was just still up. All right. Well, I just want to thank everybody. Oh, sorry.
Accident.
Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you, Yeshe and Zopa, for being willing to have this conversation. I feel like I've learned so much today, and I'm looking forward to actually maybe watching this over again at some point. Is there anything y'all would like to say to close?
I want to thank all of you for being here and participating in this. I feel like this also is ritual, and this also is a sense of stepping along the path. And so in recognition of that, I also just want to encourage everybody to take whatever goodness has come from this and share it freely, just in your minds with everyone, with the whole planet and beyond the planet, everybody that needs it, and make the aspiration that we do, keep doing the ritual to the point where we recognize the sacredness everywhere. So that's all I want to say.
I'll just say Sarva Mangalam. May all benefit.
Oh, can we something?
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you all.
Yeah. Can we actually just sound an ah together as our sort of closing ritual for this time? Imagine the benefit going to all beings. You can unmute yourself if you'd like. We can all say it together. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for spearheading this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being willing to do it. And, I'll get the recording available, so if you want to rewatch it, you can. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank all three.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you all.
Lovely to see you people.
Yes. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Let's see. How does this end?
Bye, Pushpa. You rock.
I love my children. I love my children. My children so far away.
Thank you anyway. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. You